Andrew, 30 years in forestry, land management, ecosystem services. That's a really career, a big career that's watched the relationship between agriculture and the environment shift enormously. For you, what's changed most in that time, and what problem were you most determined to solve?
Well, yeah, 30 years in forestry and land management actually gives you a fairly clear view of what's actually changed over time. For me and what I've seen, when I started out, agriculture and the environment were actually treated as separate conversations. You had kind of production on one side of the conversation and an environment on the other. But over time, that's actually kind of blurred now. And it's partly because of climate change discussions, water quality kind of pressures, but also because landholders actually been asked to do more, deliver more, on the same land base. For them, they're asked to go beyond just productivity and then think about the environment as well. So there's growing recognition that land isn't just a production asset anymore. It's a living system, and how that's actually managed, has a direct impact on whether it improves, holds steady, or declines. So the problem I've been most focused on in the latter part of my career is actually bridging that gap between the intent and the execution, because I find that most landholders, particularly graziers, really do want to look after their land better, but there's actually a shortage of kind of clear advice. So the challenge isn't, I kind of apologise, but the challenge, it doesn't necessarily translate into clear practical decisions on the ground, I guess, with the advice that they're giving. So what's really led me to ecosystem services and ultimately building decision support systems such as Drover, which we'll kind of get into, is we're trying to connect land condition, grazing, land management, the environment outcomes in a way that actually works in practice and not just theory.
Fantastic. And I think that, that idea that really landholders are ultimately stewards of their land for, and in many cases, generations. And so they do really want to see that land, hold up and be a strong system. So on that, I have a question for you before we dive into the technical piece. In your words or in your thinking, what is circular economy? We sort of hear it as this sort of abstract term, but, not the textbook definition, but what does it mean to you personally?
Well, personally, to me, it kind of starts with a pretty simple idea, and that's that everything's connected. So we'll kind of use a grazing property for an example. What happens in one part of the system affects everything else. The way that you manage your ground cover influences your pasture growth. Pasture growth affects your productivity. Ground cover actually also influences erosion and water quality. Improved land condition can support carbon outcomes. So none of those things kind of exist in isolation. I think for a long time we've tended to look at these outcomes as separately. Agriculture is one discussion, the environment's another discussion. Carbon's been a newer discussion. Water quality is now emergent as yet another discussion. But what actually excites me about the circular economy is it's not about recognising. It's actually about recognizing those connections and managing, the system as a whole.
Yeah. And for a place like the Herbert catchment, I mean, it's quite diverse in terms of topography. On the coast in the Hinchinbrook, we've got, really big cane community, and then the tablelands, particularly around the Herbert catchment, is graziers. So what should circular economy mean for that catchment?
For the Herbert, it's probably quite similar for a lot of catchment areas. But what happens on your property doesn't actually stay on your property. It affects productivity, local businesses, waterways, communities. For the Herbert, ultimately the Great Barrier Reef as well. So the challenge has been that we tend to value things separately, even though they're all linked. So if we think about these connections and making sure that value is created by good land management flows, that goes back to the people and the communities kind of generating that. Right now, a lot of value is actually overlooked. And a lot of the value, can actually leave the region altogether. So the opportunities to keep it local, whether it's through improved productivity or carbon projects, a landholder could already be working on their productivity, but are they aware that that's actually generating, carbon or biodiversity kind of gains at the same time? So it's kind of an opportunity, lost.
Yeah, really love that framing around value creation, because I think that's, the thing that, and that's the reason why also the word economy is in that, circularity piece. Is it's not just this idea about, let's just recycle more. That's not it at all. Circular economy has three principles, and regeneration of nature is a fundamental principle. And as you said, there's biodiversity and also carbon gains to be had from that. So expanding this conversation, and I'm really excited to talk about also, hear more about Drover and what you're doing with that, because that's a land management decision support system, which you were just talking about before. Is that, there is a myriad of information, but how do we actually translate that into something that's really practical and pragmatic? So tell us, what does it actually do, like on a day-to-day, like for a grazier that's never heard of it?
Well, I mean, you're spot on. At a practical level, Drove is a decision support system, tailored at the moment for grazing land management. But what it does is helps the grazier decide, where to invest effort and any funding they have across the property to lift performance above long-term kind of land condition averages. So I believe in most grazing enterprises, the challenge isn't a lack of willingness to improve the land. It's knowing where the interventions will actually make a measurable difference versus areas that are already performing close to their full potential. So what Drover does is it kind of brings together multiple layers of information, particularly or mostly satellite-derived data, indicators such as ground cover and land condition, and it translates that into kind of a clear spatial guidance on where improvement in and your efforts to make change will actually have the greatest return. So it helps answers a few kind of practical questions like, which part of my property is underperforming? Where's the greatest potential for, for lift in ground cover and pasture condition? And if you've got limited capital time, where should I actually focus on achieving the biggest combined gain in productivity and environmental gains as well. So
it gives both the data and the evidence to support not just what to do, but also helps then, ascertain like what's the most, the best bang for buck, so to speak, both in terms of dollars spent perhaps, but also in terms of outcomes that they'll achieve from an improvement perspective.
Yeah, it ultimately kind of comes back to a simple principle of, where the effort goes matters more to how much effort you put in. And Drover will show you, again, within your property, where that is.
So tell me a little bit more, because it's also linked to the GLM, the Grazing Land Management Reef Credit Method, and that's Australia's first market-based method that actually does support rewarding graziers for stewardship. So what does it actually do and unlock for a landholder if they use a tool, not just like Drover, but also the GLM method?
Yeah, so Drover is based on the GLM method under reef credits and soon to be aquis credits, which means it can apply Australia-wide. The underlying data in the environmental assessment frameworks, that supports the Drover is actually what is required for your reporting, your verification, and your validation of credits. So if you run Drover, and you get those mapping outputs, and the numbers that are attached to it in terms of ground cover increases and sediment save, which is ultimately water quality improvement. Drover will actually give the numbers required for that crediting to occur.
So this really lends itself to the idea of, I think, that it's productivity, but it's also around profitability, and there's a new potential for revenue as well when you apply that method.
Yeah, that's correct. It will quantify your improvements to water quality, and that value is actually a credit under the reef credit scheme, at the moment. And there can be a value attached to selling that credit, kind of downstream to anybody who's needs either like an offset or is seeking improvement in water quality.
So do you want to tell us, you have worked specifically, you've got a case study, I think, with Kalawira property, which has shown, I think, a significant increase in biomass using Drover, the tool. So sort of what happened and what changed and what drove those results?
Kalawira was actually one of the properties that we were working on, which was actually a stepping stone to developing Drover. But it's an awesome kind of case study in terms of what's possible. It was a project that we worked with under Great Barrier Reef Foundation kind of funding for improvement of water quality of the Fitzroy. And so through that project, we actually invested a fair bit in wire and water. But to me, it's actually not the wire and water investment that was the biggest change on that property or generated the biggest change. It was actually the landholders' attitude and commitment to making that grazing practice change, for the benefit of their productivity, but as well as the Great Barrier Reef in this particular instance. So the grazier actually started managing paddocks for recovery rather than kind of continuous utilisation. So kind of moved to periods of spelling country, when it needed, doing that at the right time. They did make adjustments to stocking pressure based on seasonal conditions, and really did avoid overgrazing in some areas, during the more vulnerable periods. So a key driver for all that was ground cover recovery. Mm-hmm. So once they improve the ground cover, you're able to improve your moisture retention, your soil condition, your pasture growth, and it created a kind of a compounding effect over time.
And Drover really helps measure that over time, right?
That's right. Drover in the reef space can actually track monthly changes in ground cover and water quality improvement. Seasonal probably gives you a better indication of how you're performing. So not only does Drover kind of create the opportunity for a credit, it actually also validates your practice change. It actually shows you that you're on the right track, and you're making kind of tangible and quantifiable kind of differences out in the field, rather than just I guess your intuition, what you see in the paddock, that the numbers are confirmed. And Drover provides that validation.
So, I mean, we see obviously with the Herbert being such a crucial a catchment in terms of its location, or adjacent to the Great Barrier Reef, and so there is a lot of pressure on landholders to make changes in practices, but the sort of then that connection with the reef is sort of really what you see on property. They're involved in getting their cattle healthy and fed and to market at the end of the day, and so what is it that brings graziers to the table for this broader piece of work that does help the catchment overall healthy, and what makes them sort of stay at the table in your experience?
Look, in our experience, there's some nervousness around markets because it's still kind of new and a little bit kind of unknown. But we are aware that graziers do have already quite a deep relationship with the land. They know their land better than anybody else. That's kind of undeniable. So for us, the entry point, the first kind of discussion is normally around their business enterprise, their productivity. And are there any areas on their property that are actually underperforming, in that regard? Because if they are, they're actually also the parts of the property where you probably have the biggest gains to be made from like an environmental kind of downstream benefit. So if they can improve their productivity, that actually also is likely to improve their drought resilience. It obviously improves their pasture performance and their operational efficiency. So we tend to focus on that. Yeah, so once there's actually a practical benefit on property as visible for them, those environmental outcomes, they then become part of the conversation, not necessarily the starting point of the conversation for most.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to the age old, sort of you meet people where they're at, and also, you've got to really understand the what's in it for me in terms of, they're a private enterprise, they're operating, very varying scales. And so understanding what's important to them, generally, it comes, starts with productivity and profitability. And then, but also the added value and of ecosystem, thinking about the ecosystem really, enables that over a much longer term. So you're really, I guess, helping them understand how those two things can work together, both, productivity, but also ecosystem services, and then the markets is the added benefit, but not necessarily the core driver.
That's right. It comes back to kind of what we said at the start, that they're all connected.
Awesome. Now, thank you, Andrea. This has been really great chat. I know we sort of sped through it. The idea is to give the graziers in the catchment a bit of an understanding on kind of what we're doing in circular economy more broadly as part of the Herbert integrated project. And linking that obviously to water quality outcomes and the health of the Great Barrier Reef. What do you think the highest priority is for reef catchments in Queensland and for graziers specifically in the Herbert?
Well, yeah, the Herbert's one of the most important reef influenced catchments in Queensland. And so there's a lot of opportunity. So for graziers, good land management can be recognised and rewarded. It's not just in theory, but now, and it's recent, but now we can do it through structured markets such as reef credits. So what drove the GLM reef credit methods do is to help the ground management, the on-ground management to those markets in a practical way. Environmental performance actually becomes measurable and tradable, and it's linked to real operational decisions and a genuine opportunity for landholders in the Herbert.
So if someone's watching this and wondering, whether they could be using the Drover product or just more in broadly how they might kind of go about taking the next step, what do you want them to take away from this conversation?
More than anything, is to perhaps start thinking, of how everything is connected, and then knowing, what's opportunities and are available, I guess, to capitalise on that. But being fully aware that that markets aren't actually a replacement for grazing outcomes. It's actually complementary. And so if you can think about it as that, as a complementary to your existing business, then please, reach out. We're very keen to have a discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been really great chatting to you, Andrew, and we look forward to, I'm sure we could speak on this topic at length, and I'm sure we could have a follow-up conversation. So if there's one thing that you wish, more people understood about, how the circular economy and nature regeneration works, is there anything you want to leave us with?
Look, honestly, everything's connected. Everything that you do on the land, it's not just necessarily for for one purpose. It'll have kind of multiple benefits, and people's, I guess, activities do affect the community. They do affect the environment as well as their own business. But we can absolutely kind of create a win-win kind of situation for everybody if you kind of think more about the circular economy and how it actually works and what it means for graziers in particular.
Fantastic. I love that. And we're going back to really to the beginning, which is really around value creation. So on property or on, value creation, but community value creation, economic value creation, and also value creation for the broader catchment as an ecosystem. Thanks so much for joining us, Andrew. Appreciate your time.
Not a problem. Absolute pleasure. Anytime.